Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this next episode of the Akkad and Coca Report. I'm your co-host, Michel Akkad in San Francisco, and joining me from Philadelphia is Anish Coca, as always. Now, regular listeners of the show know that we are not averse to discussing controversial matters. Today, however, I have a feeling that we are tackling the most controversial topic so far. A topic more controversial than the incoherence of evidence-based medicine, more controversial than the falsity of brain death, more controversial than the virtues of a free market in healthcare. What topic could that be? You may have guessed it. We're going to talk about the health benefit of the keto diet. And with us to bravely weather the storm of controversy, we are delighted to have as our guest Dr. Ethan Weiss. Dr. Weiss is an associate professor of cardiology at the University of California, San Francisco. He has a stellar academic pedigree, having received his MD degree from Johns Hopkins Medical School, where he also trained as part of his internship and residency. He completed his fellowship in cardiology at UCSF, where he had the misfortune of rubbing elbows with an upstart by the name of Michel Akkad. And he has had a great career as a basic science investigator at UCSF, studying the relationship between heart disease and metabolism. In other words, no one should dare to call into question what Dr. Weiss is about to tell us about the keto diet, although I suspect that that will not stop the passions from running hot anyways. Ethan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Anish, for having me.
Great. Any disclaimers you want to start the conversation with?
Well, yeah, I mean, we shouldn't spend the whole. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this new venture in my life, but we shouldn't. I mean,
we're not. This is always, this is sort of a clickbait to get people to listen. We'll talk about your life as a young investigator and all the other interesting things you're doing.
But well, I will say, yeah, young, almost 50. I will say that, I've been listening a lot to your guys' podcasts, and one of the recent topics was on conflict of interest and financial conflict of interest. So I might as well just get that out of the way now, that when we do eventually talk about this thing, I am extraordinarily conflicted financially in that I'm a co-founder of this company when we get to that. So let's just dispense with that.
That's all right. But why don't we get to, why don't dispense with it from the get-go? I mean, I'm genuinely interested. I'm actually, it was a facetious intro.
Yeah.
But... diet is a very important topic. It's on everybody's mind, whether they're MDs or not MDs. MDs are not necessarily the best person, so far have not been the best person to get any advice from, but it's an important question, and I think I'd like to explore it with you and discuss it and see what your thoughts are, and we can speak candidly. And yes, you have. So tell us a little bit about this company, and then we'll talk more generally about metabolism and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well,
and we don't have to spend a lot of time because
no, it's fine. I mean, maybe we should start by that. You mentioned this idea that physicians may or may not be the best people to give out diet advice, and I'll say that one of the ways I got here, and there's probably a long path, but one of the sort of key motivators for me was that I felt like when I would see patients downstairs in the office, and they'd come to me and they'd say, doctor or Ethan or whatever they were calling me, I really would like to lose some weight. What should I do? And consistently my answer was some form of eat less and exercise more, or some combination of that. And I would say the performance of that intervention was as consistently poor as anything else I've ever done in my entire life. And so it occurred to me that we had to do better, or at least I wanted to try to do better. So that's kind of how that was the big right. reason. So, yeah. Well, look, the truth is, Michelle, well, like I've been here in San Francisco for 20 years now, and I came here as a young cardiology fellow and got trained in the cath lab by the best. We can talk about that later. And then, I went off and did my science training and started my own lab. And back in the day, you probably know this, but others don't, I was working in an area of biology that's very different from what I'm doing now. And that was trying to understand blood clotting and mechanisms, and specifically, sex differences in blood clotting. And that was, frankly, more related to cardiology, at least at the time, than metabolism was. And then I kind of made this change in my life, and we can talk about how and why I got there. But I did have this awakening about 5 years ago where I realized that, like, while I loved what I was doing and I was super excited to get to come to work every day, and I felt privileged and lucky to do it, and I think the people our team was really excited. I often wondered if there were more than 25 or 30 people in the universe who really cared about what we were doing, and so I started to think a little bit more about impact. And coincident with this idea that the circles, the concentric circles of metabolism and cardiology started to merge, and I realized I
Okay.
was kind of giving people nothing. I started to think about ways that I could uh, help. That was
Right,
the birth of
that
it.
sounds good. But let's talk about this a little bit. These
Yeah.
metabolism and cardiology merging. Because, I mean, at least superficially, it seems that people have talked about diet and heart disease for ages, right? And that's
Yeah.
part of the problem. So what did change, and how did you get interested in any shift that may have occurred in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I came to studying metabolism in the lab by accident. We made a knockout mouse. The knockout mouse had a phenotype. The phenotype was that it had a fatty liver. I didn't even know what fatty liver was at that time, and kind of eventually, kind of iteratively, ended up changing the entire focus of my lab. So I was telling people would say, "Well, why are you interested in metabolism or diabetes?" And I'd say, "Well, uh, because it's the biggest risk factor for heart attacks, other than smoking cigarettes." But the truth was, that's not true. I mean, I was,
That's very
you
interesting.
know,
I actually I didn't know that about how you got into this
yeah,
this
I mean,
field.
that was,
You know, it's funny, as an aside, when I was a fellow working with mice also in my research project, I ended up getting a mouse. You know, it was also a transgenic mouse or a
yeah.
double knockout. And it was hugely obese. I mean, it was a litter of hugely obese mice. And but they wouldn't breed. I was stuck. I couldn't do anything with them.
That's the worst. Yeah.
Right. Anyways, keep going.
So yeah, so Ray, so Ethan, you were saying, how
Yeah.
did you? So what happened? How did you? So you were working in the sex difference anticoagulation, and you made a knockout. The knockout was fatty liver,
Is
and
this like a 5 hour long podcast or a 1 hour long
no,
podcast? I'll give you the quick and dirty answer, which was I got fascinated
please.
by sex differences that we were seeing in these clotting models in the mouse, and then I started to kind of think, well, maybe there are sex differences in the way in clotting in humans, and I got into this. Well, maybe women bleed more in the cath lab. You know, all this stuff that I could weave together a story that made sense. And I thought, gosh, this biology of sex differences is fascinating. And so I did a pretty deep dive on that, and it turns out that at least in mammals, well, keep this simple. So the liver itself is a phenomenally sexually dimorphic organ, meaning that there are thousands of genes that are expressed hundreds of fold different between males and females. And that pattern, this signature that you see of liver gene expression, is driven by a sexually dimorphic pattern of growth hormone secretion. So that is that the pituitary secretes growth hormone in two distinct patterns in males and females. Males have a more pulsatile pattern where they get big pulses and then long periods where there's none, and females have more consistent. There's shorter intervals between the spikes. And so I thought, well, this is great. This is, the liver is really also where all these clotting factors are made. So let's explore whether this is actually the mechanism of sex differences in clotting. And so the very first paper I published as an independent investigator was describing the sex differences of clotting in mice as related to this growth hormone thing. And so, the next thing you do, as Michelle knows, is you start going and knocking out different genes in the pathway. And so we started knocking out different genes in the pathway. One of them was this, downstream signaling component of this pathway, and we knocked that out, and that mouse got this rip-roaring fatty liver. And I'll never forget, because the technician who worked with me in the lab brought me these livers, and he's like, there's something wrong. And he said, I don't even have to genotype these mice, you can see. And I was very naive about this, and I remember going to Phil Ursel, who's a pathologist who I think is retired here at UCSF, and I showed Phil the livers, and I said, Phil, what is this? And he said, Ethan, I'll look at it under the microscope, but I can tell you that's fatty liver. And I think we trained in an era where I didn't know what NAFLD or NASH or any of these other things were. I mean, I heard of that only after I'd finished my training.
For the audience, those are the acronyms for the clinical condition of fatty liver, NASH, non-alcoholic fatty or steatohepatitis, that sort of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So that was sort of how I got to doing what I was doing in the lab, what I've been doing in the lab for the past 10 years. We got away from keto though.
Yeah. So, but we're going towards it, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, that's we're inching towards it. Yeah. And at the same time, I mean, if that was in the last 5-10 years, or 5-7 years, I remember. I think 4 years ago, I read Gary Taub's book, "Good Calorie, Bad Calorie," which I thought was very fascinating. I was really thrilled about the way he demolished the standard lipid heart hypothesis. Which, in my own little way, I was growing skeptical of, and then he spent a lot of the book talking about his ideas, and then I got lost a little bit, and so forth. What pathway did you take regarding?
How did you get Ethan to? Or meaning, did you arrive? Is it because of the work you were doing?
Yeah. So
this fatty liver knockout that led you to this interest in diet, or like how did you go from being the average cardiologist, which is I don't know what the heck to tell my patients about diet, to having at least some type of formative things that you're now.
There's a thread, and so what I was doing this metabolism work, and obviously it's all very mouse based, and again satisfying on a personal level, but I was also kind of left wondering what impact it's going to have on the world. And around 4 or 5 years ago, I got a phone call from a headhunter to look at a job, and I get these calls from time to time, and most of the time I just say, I'm not really interested, I'm happy where I am. And this one was interesting because it was a technology company that's based here in San Francisco. It's called Omada Health, and they were basically taking, I don't know if you guys remember the old DPP, the Diabetes Prevention Program. They were taking that program and they were trying to operationalize it using technology. It's a company that still exists, and they raised a lot of money.
The DPP, the Diabetes Prevention, it's sort of a stepwise program to get people who have diabetes to control their diabetes better with
so the idea was
coaching and whatnot and that sort of thing.
So you take people with pre-diabetes and you do intensive in-person health coaching. And they were delivering this in like YMCA's and churches and stuff like that. And the actual original DPP, which was published in the New England Journal, I think like 2001, 2002, they compared 3 arms. One was sort of standard of care. One was this intensive health coaching, and then the other arm was metformin. And the result of that study, at least the initial one that got published in NEJM, was that the intensive health coaching was better at preventing the onset of type 2 diabetes than even metformin, and much better than just kind of standard eat less and exercise more.
Right.
And so this company was taking the approach of, hey, look, it's pretty expensive and not very efficient to deliver this program in brick and mortar buildings with one health coach to 12 people. We could do this online with one of these things, a smartphone, and make it like 10x more efficient. And so that was what they were doing. And so I got asked to look at a job there that I obviously did not end up taking, but it opened my eyes to the power of technology, and it opened my eyes to the world of nutrition. And so around the same time, I also would do consulting from time to time for various people asking me about new drugs coming down the pipeline. And I think all of us are aware that, there was this big splash a few years ago when these new molecules showed up called PCSK9 inhibitors. And I think, if you follow that story, it's probably, in my opinion, the best example, the best story of sort of discovery to market of any drug that I can recall, right? Here was this, molecule that was discovered. It's important in this pathway that we know is important in cardiovascular disease. There were human genetic mutations, gain of function, loss of function that were concordant. They were able to drug it using this new technology, this antibody, and they could reduce the concentration and reduce the cholesterol from, whatever it was, LDL of 100 down to 25, and super powerful. And then they did these 2 big outcome studies, and they were both positive in reducing the combined endpoint. And gosh, what an amazing story. And they're commercial flops, right? No one uses them, or, not no one, but very few people use them. So you can get into a long conversation about why that is and whether the companies themselves shot themselves in the foot by, or, pricing them too expensive. But one of the things that occurred to me was that, gosh, we really have a pretty good, closet of tools we can use to treat patients pharmacologically. And so I started to wonder, does it make sense economically? Are we going to be able to develop, like this is as good a story as you can get, and yet the economics don't make sense. So are we going to be able to develop new therapies in this space, in these big, I'm not talking about rare diseases or cancer, I'm talking about big chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, metabolism, obesity, diabetes. Is it going to be economically feasible to develop new drugs to target these diseases, or do we have to take a different approach? And so I think going and looking at this job at Omada opened my eyes to the possibility that, hey, gosh, we've got all this technology, and maybe we can hammer at this other arm of lifestyle interventions that's been ignored largely for, as long as I can remember. So that was
that's fascinating. Yeah. That's fascinating. But at the same time, don't you think that people, and I'm not necessarily sort of endorsing their approach in one way or another, but there have been people, lone voices. I guess they would claim that there were lone voices in the wilderness all along. Dean Ornish and other people like that saying, we should do this in this way or that way. And yet now there's a lot more interest, I think. What's the difference between the way it was 20 years ago when, I forgot his last name, but there was another plant-based diet guru.
Andy Weil?
Andy Weil, another person. He was actually a heart surgeon.
Dean Ornish, or
no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But I mean, there were these guys who were talking about that sort of approach, and who wanted to spread the gospel. What's changing now? And you think that is the economics, as you said? I mean, that's a very interesting perspective. That the magic bullets drug that you can pop in, it seems too hard to make. It seems hard to make an economic case for this, as you say.
For me, it's two things, right? So one is that there's been this realization. We've seen it again. We'll see it again as think about secondary prevention of MI, right? Which before 5 or 6 years ago we had two drugs, aspirin and statins, to use, and now in the past 5 or 6 years we've had two different lipid classes, ezetimibe, both the PCSK9 inhibitors. We've got two new classes of diabetes drugs. We have rivaroxaban that was published for a secondary prevention, thing. We have canakinumab, this, IL, whatever it is, IL-1, IL-12, I can't even remember. And, most recently we have this REDUCE-IT trial, right? There's the Vasipa, which is this fish oil trial. So, hordes of these new opportunities. So how do you, as a physician sitting in the office, how do you decide which one of these things to give to which patient? And there is going to be a difficulty in sort of, you can't give them all. You're not going to want to give them all. And I think also patients are wanting to take control of their health more than, and I find, at least in our area, that there's more skepticism for taking drugs. So I think there was that going on. And then to me, the real reason that this has gotten more traction in the past few years, and why, Dean Ornish and all these other people, while I think they made splash within the community, was at that time what they were selling was a program. You could buy their book and maybe buy something else on their website to help facilitate it, but there wasn't something that could scale it, I think, in my opinion, and that to me is the difference. That was what I learned in looking at this Amada position, was that technology, that everybody's connected to a cell phone, the whole world, everyone has one, and if you could somehow figure out a way to use that to deliver these therapies, that would change the entire game.
That's interesting. How important do you think those technologies are to delivering new ways of eating or new ways of behaving, and that sort of thing? And one last point I want to make here before you answer that question is that yes, you're absolutely right, and also the distinction between the drugs and changing your behavior, your diet, is that the drugs will make the numbers look better, but nobody really believes that they make you healthier, right? In and of themselves, you don't become healthier from a PCSK9 and that sort of thing. Whereas with the diet, it is possible. Go ahead. Sorry.
I don't know if I agree with you about that, but I will tell you this: that you don't get joy. Like there are very few people who will come to you to say, "You've improved my life so dramatically by putting me on this PCSK9 inhibitor. Everything is different." Whereas like somebody who comes in your office after losing 25 pounds because of something that you helped them do, that's an incredibly satisfying experience for them. So I do think that, maybe, I don't know, feel better is the wrong thing, because we're trying to prevent the onset of these diseases that are really silent until they're not. But I do think that you're not.
No, I mean, so I'm sorry. Let me clarify. They will actually decrease the event rates of certain conditions. They will so yes, they will do that, but that won't make people feel that they're healthier just because their event rate is lower, right?
True. I think that's one of the big obstacles for taking. I mean, I think we all have patients who don't want to take some of these therapies that we recommend, and I think one of the big obstacles is they don't feel better. If anything, they might feel worse, and so that's hard, right? You tell them, well, here's this event that you may or may not have in 25 or 30 years, so take this expensive pill, or better yet, inject yourself with this expensive medicine once every 2 weeks, and it's going to cost you X number of $100 a month. And oh, by the way, I can't even tell you if it's going to necessarily work. So I do think that there is you can understand why people don't love that.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. But Ethan, so I'm interested in this last step that you're titillating me with. Like, I mean, you're a UCSF basic science researcher. You're also a clinical cardiologist, of course. I'm curious to know how it is I've been following you on Twitter now for many years, and clearly over time, it seemed that you've become friendlier and friendlier to a certain type of diet, and that diet being, low carb, high protein, however you want to call it, LCHF or keto diet. But I'm interested in your being turned on to that. How did you come at it?
Okay, let me connect the dots for you. So I told you I looked at this job at Omada. It turns out I met this guy who was at Omada at the time, and he left Omada and went to work at this other company, this other startup company. He also based here in San Francisco. And so he calls me one afternoon and says, we should have lunch. I said, fine. So we go out, we have lunch. And he says, listen, I'm working at this new company, and it's kind of similar in some ways to what Omada was doing, but they have a different intervention. The nutrition is different. They're delivering this thing called the ketogenic diet. And, I had remembered that. I went to medical school at Hopkins, and John Freeman, who was a neurologist, I think he died a few years ago, was, I think, the one who brought that back to use to treat children with epilepsy, which I've learned is an incredibly powerful tool. And so I remembered the word, and I vaguely remembered, I remembered the whole Atkins craze. And so I said, oh, that's interesting. I'll learn more. And so kind of in parallel, I did a deep dive on kind of what I could find. And then he introduced me to an investor. I think he was the main investor for this company called Verta Health. And he and I had a great talk. And he said to me, Ethan, you're not going to believe these data. He says, I'm biased, of course, because I've invested in this company and I stand to make a lot of money. But I think the results are as powerful as anything we've seen for weight loss or management of diabetes short of bariatric surgery. And I had definitely begun to appreciate that in the right patient, bariatric surgery is an incredibly powerful intervention. It happens to be a difficult, morbid, operation that is not going to, we cannot apply to the 80 million people who are overweight or obese in this country, right? There's no way we can do that. So I was curious. And so, I went and read everything I could read. I found the first publication that I could find from the ketogenic diet was published in like 1797 by a surgeon. And so over this process, I got to know this company. They eventually asked me to join their advisory board, and I've done that for 2 years. And so
actually, tell me about that that paper, because I always love the historical angle.
Yeah.
What did that guy in the 18th century? What was he treating?
Well, these guys
obesity or what?
It was diabetes. So, and of course, back then they didn't define diabetes as we do today. It wasn't like type 1, type 2. It was just sugar. And the way they diagnosed it was tasting their patient's urine, which is sort of, humorous. You can't really imagine anything like that happening today. But physicians were forced to be much more creative back then because, of course, they didn't have, drugs or devices or operations to offer people. And so there were a group of physicians who understood that there was a power in nutrition and they could figure out ways to modulate people's health using nutrition. Now, if you read this, and I'll send it to you, you can put it in the show notes, but if you read this description of what they were feeding these people, it was revolting. I mean, it was absolutely disgusting. But he went through this like incredibly rigorous, careful diary of these, handful of patients, right? This is not like a 5,000, RCT, trial. This was like 4 people. And he admitted them to the hospital and basically fed them this, awful stuff. And he was testing their
all
urine.
Meat, or when you say awful,
it was almost all meat, but it was worse that it was like
animal liver.
No, but it was like blood curdled, and intestine, or it was just like really, really nasty. But he described like curing, or not curing, but at least reversing their diabetes, for lack of a better word. That they stopped having sugar in their urine, and that they lost a lot of weight, and that they didn't have acetone on their breath, or all the other things that were that manifest their diabetes. So that was fun to go back, and you could see that sort of trail go all the way through the 19th century. There was an Italian, I think his name was like Cantani or something, and he had a diet. He was like the prototype, predecessor to all these modern diet doctors, right? It was the Cantani diet, and it was basically a low carb, high fat diet. They realized if you just restrict all these carbohydrates, that you could make people's diabetes get better. So this was not a new thing. It just happened to go away, coincident with the discovery of insulin, right? I mean, when insulin came to the market or was discovered in the early 20th century, there was really no reason people felt like they needed to explore these other interventions anymore because they'd cured diabetes with insulin. At least that's my read of it, of what happened. So it wasn't until like the 1970s when people like Atkins and other people rediscovered these different interventions that this whole thing got going again.
So just for clarity, fasting or no fasting, or how does that play in? In the 19th century, did they advocate fasting as well as a low-carb diet? Or
well, there are publications of prolonged fasts going back into the 19th century, and then of course into the 20th century with the famous studies that were done, in Boston, where they would fast people for hundreds of days, and we don't have to go into that. But as far as I know, they weren't done together. So I don't think there was a low carb, high fat diet and intermittent fasting. Or like there was I don't think at least I haven't found any papers describing the use of both of them concurrently.
Okay, so that's more recent, sort of this idea of combining those two, putting you on a low carb diet. Well, define for us what is. I mean, is there a standard? I mean, do people, when they say, if we're going to use the term the keto diet, do people is there a standard understanding or a common understanding of what that means?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot. The way I would define it is, so there are two ways to define it, right? There's a threshold of carbohydrate intake that you would have during the day, and mostly people think it's in the range of 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates per day or less, and that's one way to define it. But really, to me, the way to define a ketogenic diet, if you're really going to take it at face value, is a diet that promotes tells your liver to start making these ketone bodies. And Steve Phinney, who's the scientific co-founder, chief medical officer at Virta Health, who really took over as the godfather of this ketogenic diet, he defines it as having a concentration of beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the sort of most common ketone body, of 0.5 millimolar or greater in your blood. Okay. I think that's a relatively arbitrary number, but in that range, when you're making, because we all have some ketones at different points of time between meals, and I think it's fascinating to think about how ketones came to be and why we evolved to have them. I mean, it's an interesting, that's a whole different conversation, but.
Right, yeah. And somebody for not just the audience, but just for me, who's not versed in that literature, that means that fats are being used as fuel and being broken down. Okay, so
I mean, if you think about the way that most animals, including we humans, existed before refrigerators or preservatives, right? We ate when we had food, and if you look at an animal in the wild, it's not eating 3 meals a day and like having a little bag of like smart food for a snack, right? It eats when there's food. So there has to be a way to maintain this glucose level of roughly 100 milligrams per deciliter throughout the day, and the body, and the mechanism we evolved was that we carry around this energy source in our fat. And fat, I tell people fat serves two purposes. One is it's insulative, so it keeps us from freezing to death, but it also is this sort of reserve fuel supply. And I'm fascinated with adipose tissue biology. It's kind of what we're thinking about now in the lab all day long. But really what happens is if you don't have enough calories or don't have enough glucose, that your brain particularly, but other organs as well, can't process really it's the only molecule they can use to process other than this ketone body, or set of ketone bodies. So what happens is that you basically mobilize all this fat in this process we call lipolysis. So that's taking a triglyceride and cleaving it into its components, which are fatty acids and glycerol. And then those go to the liver. And in the liver, they get converted through a series of chemical reactions to a molecule called acetoacetate. And that is sort of the parent of the ketone bodies. And then that gets broken down into the other ones, beta hydroxybutyrate and acetone. But all of those molecules are used as fuel by certain tissues, mostly during starvation. But you can trick your body into kind of feeling like it's starved or thinking that it's starved by restricting carbohydrate intake. That's kind of the easiest way I can explain it.
Okay, so that's fine. So without necessarily the need to fast, or
right.
Are there different schools? I mean, you get so much bang for the buck by just reducing carbs, and then if you want more, then you introduce the fasting. Would that be sort of a... a way of describing it, or?
Yeah, so I mean, look, the keto diet has been around and popularized, especially here, in places like Silicon Valley and other places. There have been people using it. This biohacking, movement that, frankly, like I found sort of annoying for a long time, and didn't understand it, and kind of tried. I don't know. I won't make any other editorial comments, but these people. Were sorry, I lost my train of thought because I got a phone call from my daughter that I just ignored. So
Do you want to pause? We can
no,
pause.
no, we're
Okay.
okay.
All right.
It's okay. I just
Okay.
remind me where I was.
So I was talking
Yeah,
about whether the fasting was just added you start with
yeah.
the low
Sorry.
carb and then you add
Yeah.
the right.
So this keto thing, I think if you ask people what the benefits are of keto as a nutritional intervention, you'll hear a bunch of different things. One of the things that you hear, and I have to say that anecdotally, it's been very true for me as I've been doing this diet for the last 10 months, is that you're just less hungry. And so I think one principle that I've learned over the past couple of years is that we as kids are conditioned to eat at times even when we're not hungry, right? I mean, we have this like sense of, oh well, there's a schedule you have to adhere to, and I think even when you bring home your baby for the first time, like there's this paranoia over they're not getting enough nutrition, and so we condition our children to eat all the time, and so then they have this like sense that if they're not eating, they're hungry. But the truth is, like, why would you eat if you're not hungry? And it occurred to me like a couple of years ago that was something that I wanted to think about and push back on. And for me and others, when you're doing this keto diet, you're just less hungry. So I do eat less during the day, and I think that may be one of the main mechanisms for weight loss is that I'm just not eating as much.
Right. So it sounds like I mean, it's a plausible story, right? The whole keto pathway story sounds very plausible. At the same time, there's not a widespread acceptance of it, or I mean, it still is controversial, and you still is that I mean, even
Well,
among people who are reasonably well versed with the science. Can you speak to that also? I mean, do people say? I mean, there are people who.
Is it the case? Is it the case, Ethan, that one would recommend this over other types of limited caloric intakes?
It's a great question. So let me tell you this, and I think as the three of us both spend more time than we ought to on Twitter, I think we're all probably aware that there are multiple religious wars going on out there in our world, and one of the most, and Michelle, you addressed this in the intro kind of facetiously, but one of the most passionate of these wars is this nutrition diet war, and there are people, I think we know them, who have represent their nutritional passion by putting a symbol for a plant or a piece of meat in their name on Twitter. And I think that speaks to how much people care about this stuff. But one of the big arguments is sort of is there a potential benefit? Is there a benefit? So Gary Taubes would say that there's a metabolic advantage to eating this keto diet, and that advantage is an optimization of energy expenditure, where you're going to basically spend more energy than you're taking in, and that if you do that, obviously you're going to lose weight. And there are lots of people yelling very loudly about whether that's the case. So I think that's one controversy: is there a metabolic advantage? In other words, do you burn more energy on a per calorie basis if you eat this way rather than eating a normal standard American diet? The other question that comes up a lot is that question about appetite. And the truth is that, like, these things have not been studied, at least to my satisfaction, adequately for me to be able to weigh in a thoughtful way. The one thing that sort of brought me here, I would say the thing that brought me here more than any of these other things was the one thing the keto diet, or the eating this way, has that no other diet that I know of does have, is the ability to follow this biomarker. And so I have become fascinated by behavior and behavioral economics and behavioral science over the past 2 years. And one of the things that occurred to me was, if you step back and say, well, why are we doing so poorly, as a country or as a world, in helping people battle this obesity epidemic? One potential answer is that we're just not giving them the information that they need. And the story I tell is like, if you go and eat a quart of ice cream tonight, you go downstairs and eat a quart of ice cream. If you step on the scale tomorrow morning, you may not know, you probably wouldn't even notice a difference. If anything, you might lose weight, who knows? But it's not a very useful metric, that is weight. Whereas this diet has this metric that you can follow, a biomarker. And what we have found, and the reason that we ended up kind of down this path, was that we made the hypothesis that it would be a powerful behavioral hook, give people the information that they could use to stay adherent to this program, distract them from the thing that everyone pays attention to, which is their weight. And that maybe because it's restrictive, maybe because they're eating less, maybe because they're less hungry, maybe because they're burning more calories at rest, who knows? But if you adhere to this diet and get distracted from this other thing, you end up losing weight. And that was the sort of hypothesis for how we got to where
so that's the venture that you mentioned at the beginning of the show, where now you have a device that you've helped design that can actually measure ketones. Is that right? Or it's very easily from the breath or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how does it work? What does it look like? And
look, I don't know how many. Well, too bad for the people who are not.
We can describe it, right?
But it looks like a vape. We're told by a lot of people that it looks like a vape. And the truth is, like, we didn't design this. The story of how this device came to the market is that I was introduced to my co-founders. So I'm not going to bore you with all the long story, but my co-founders and I decided that this was something that we wanted to try to do, and we wanted to try to do it quickly. I'm fascinated and impressed by how fast things move outside of academia. It's been shocking to me to see the pace. We really kind of decided casually that we were going to do this in July and kind of formally in September. Right. And we have this device behind me somewhere. There's like 10,000 of these things that we're going to ship out in the next week. So that's just unbelievable. I mean, I can't get, a piece of paper written and Xeroxed in academia in less than 2 months. So, but one of the sacrifices we made in trying to optimize for speed was that we had to take a device that was already being used for something else. And so long story short was that one of my co-founders has relatives in Taiwan, and one of his relatives there is in the manufacturing and engineering world. And he knew these people who were making a consumer alcohol breathalyzer, which is, used a fair amount. You can buy them on Amazon and stuff. People use them to judge whether or not they should get behind the wheel after they've had a couple of drinks. And I guess this is becoming a bigger thing in Asia. So these guys were making this device, and so it pairs with your smartphone, and you blow into the thing, and it tells you, yes or no, don't get behind the wheel. And actually, the shell of that is this. And what we were able to do was to take the sensor that they had inside this device and swap the alcohol one out for one that was more sensitive for acetone. And acetone is this volatile organic compound, small little thing that ends up in your breath, and it's one of the ketone bodies. And so we were able to kind of make this kind of almost.
That's great. And
it was pretty interesting.
Is it? Did you get a quantity, or did you get a yay or nay, or is it what kind of answer did you get? Did you get a number?
Yeah, so we get a number that it's calibrated, and so we're able to measure it in parts per million, which is sort of the standard way that you measure acetone gas. The truth is that for two reasons. One is we didn't want to. I guess we were a little uncomfortable reporting in parts per million because we wanted to avoid people getting too fixated on. It's like when they started reporting creatinine in the hundredths. Like, is it really important to know the difference between 1.4 and 1.485? Maybe to somebody, but to me it wasn't, and it was sort of a distraction. So we made the decision for that reason, and really because we were trying to optimize this as a behavioral tool, we made the decision to report it in levels. And so you start off at level 1 or 2, and then you go up to level 8. And so that's what you'll get when you blow into this thing.
Okay.
Your smartphone.
What's a good level, or what level should you be under? Or
well, I mean, the idea is that you start off in the low range, right, 1 or 2, and then if you adhere to this diet, and if you do it right, as we tell you to do it, within 1 to 2 days, 3 at most, you'll start to see this level go up, and it's pretty fascinating to watch how people become the word we've been using is gamified, that they've become, I mean, people are naturally extraordinarily competitive, and they like to win, and they want their scores to go up, and so it's a powerful thing.
So
there's no question. Now, do you measure one time a day at a standard specified time of the day, like in the morning when you wake up, or?
No. So if you go back and like, there were papers in the 1920s describing the 3 common methods of measuring ketones in people, and that was blood, beta hydroxybutyrate, breath, acetone, and urine. You can measure ketones in the urine, and if you look, in the community of people out there doing ketogenic diet now, before our device came to market, the vast majority would do the urine. They'd pee on these strips, and that is, it's not the most, well, people don't like urine, and so there's a reason, that's sort of not as attractive. It's also probably not super accurate. They report it as like low, medium, high or something, or maybe it's like 4 different levels. And then there's the blood, and for people who don't mind pricking their finger, they do that, but those are expensive. Each strip is $1 or $2, and so there was this sort of idea that, gosh, there could be a better way, easier way to do this, and it would be cheaper. And so what we tell people is do it a few times a day. Do it first thing in the morning, do it once in the middle of the day, and do it before you have your first drink, because the sensor will be contaminated by ethanol. But the truth is that at the beginning, at least, people measure a lot more than that, because they become sort of...
Right.
So this is hooked into a smartphone, or this is just, it gives you a number on the device?
No, good. Yeah, so it's paired with a smartphone, and the smartphone basically gives you, it gives you the program. So it gives you advice about what to eat. So if you ask people sort of who've tried the ketogenic diet, why did you stop, or what was the hardest part about it, you get 3 answers. One is, I didn't know how I was doing, meaning like I couldn't measure my ketone level, or I didn't want to prick my finger, or I didn't want to pee on myself. So that was number 1. Number 2 is I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to eat. So what does 25 grams of carbohydrate mean? So we've built this, food database where you can search, you can put in Fuji Apple, it'll tell you it has 25 grams of carbohydrate or something like that. And you can put in any food you want. And we give people kind of meal plans and other things that help give them sort of a guide for how to do this. And then the other thing that we have in this app, because we've sort of stumbled onto this idea that there's this game that people want to play, is we've made like leaderboards, and so we've taken advantage of sort of what's been happening, across Silicon Valley for the past 10 or 15 years, which is that people, it's like getting a like on Twitter or whatever it is. People like that. They like to compete. And then within that, we also have built-in social support. So
it's a little bit like the Strata of dieting. I mean,
it is, yeah.
Right.
It's like Strava.
Strava,
exactly.
Sorry, yeah, Strava. Yeah,
it is.
That's great. Well, give us the name. You haven't given us the name of that.
Oh, sorry. It's
the
a
program.
very ingenious name. It's called Keto, but it's spelled with a Y. So it's Keyto.
Okay.
And we were intentionally, we were drawn to the double entendre in some ways, because you can call it the key to whatever you want to.
Sure. I think it's cute and clever, and it's great. Yeah.
And so you buy. It's how much is it?
Yeah, well, we pre-sold these devices on this crowdfunding platform. I'd never heard. I mean, I think I'd heard of Kickstarter, but I didn't understand that there are a bunch of these platforms. We chose Indiegogo, and we sold the device, I think, as of tomorrow for $99. So you get the device, and the app then comes for free. Honestly, we haven't landed on what the business model going forward is going to be, and we've toyed around with a bunch of different ideas, whether we sell the device for cheaper and we have some subscription, or whether there are all kinds of ways to build this business. And I try and kind of concentrate on the things that I know and let the business people handle the business. And
how long does this device last? Or
well, we don't know. I mean, the guys in Taiwan who make this for us say that their alcohol sensor lasted through 3,000 or 4,000 uses, which is sort of well over a year for an average user. So we anticipate that people will break them after, I'm guessing a year would be my guess if I had to. I mean, I've been carrying this one around in my pocket since early November, and I mean, literally just like right in my pocket, and it works great. So.
That's really very exciting, and it really indeed a change of pace from academia. Now it's a metric, and it's a sort of a biofeedback, if you will, right? I mean, in the broad sense of the term. we all know that not all metrics work the same or work or whatnot. I mean, we've bashed a lot of the metrics. How doctors are being metrified and given feedback to change their behaviors, and how much backlash there's been against that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that would be the case here. There are also metrics that are absolutely indispensable. I mean, I'm thinking about like the fetal heartbeat, right? Fetal heart monitors in delivery, right? It's just an incredibly powerful metric. So I
this
think
is different. Yeah, this is different because it's not.
It's voluntary. It's people want to do it.
It's not top down. It's bottom up. But
and for me, again, the principle was that you're replacing a bad metric, which is weight.
Right.
Like I love that. Like we could talk about metrics all day long, but like for me, the core of the metric conversation, really, it's most interesting to me when you talk about baseball, because for years, if you evaluate the quality of a baseball pitcher, you do that based on like the pitcher's win-loss record. And it wasn't until like the last 5 or 10 years that people have realized that that's a terrible way to evaluate the quality of a pitcher, because pitcher can't control like his defense or how many runs they score or the park they play in. And so I think weight is that like version of the won-loss record. Like it's a terrible metric if you want to lose weight, ironically.
I'll still pick Clint Eastwood over Moneyball. You know that movie?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So that's great. Do you think that that this will? I mean, in terms of what the type of reception that you've received, do you see widespread acceptance from the medical community? Do you think that the FDA should be stepping in to make a remark about efficacy here? Or I mean,
well, those are two good questions. Let me tackle them one at a time. I'll start with the FDA thing. So this is not marketed as a medical device. We've actually gotten some calls and emails from people about using it as a medical device, and the two most common of those calls come from parents of kids with seizures and come from parents or people with type 1 diabetes. And while we're totally moved and would love to explore this, we've made the very, very specific decision not to make this a medical device. So it is a consumer wellness product, or whatever the actual technical term is. So it's not regulated. So the FDA really should have no interest in what we do because we're not making claims.
So why did you choose not to get the medical indication?
Well, I mean, frankly, it was just a business decision, right? I mean, if you
10 years, you want to spend 10 years.
I mean, exactly. We want to, have to spend all. I mean, there is a play out there, and a lot of companies have done this. In fact, companies that are similar to us have done this, where you go out and you build this evidence basis that basically is going to satisfy the regulators and the payers, and then you have to go out and sell the product. So we took the other approach, was maybe people want to buy the product, and then like if there's a rationale for us to do trials down the road, then we can do those, but we did it the other way around.
So this is the exact concern that Michelle has to a huge degree. I have to some degree as well, that the current framework that exists, we're talking about the economics of creating PCSK9s and stuff, that the current model that exists in terms of getting innovative products, innovative therapies, innovative drugs to patients who need them is so utterly complex and crazy, and puts in tons and tons of costs and time that make a lot of things untenable, and we'll never know the actual cost of devices and drugs that don't actually come to be because of the regulatory framework that we have now. So it's super interesting.
I'll go further, because not only that, but and I'm not saying that to butter you up or for your product, Ethan. But it's very conceivable that if this works, you're going to say, I mean, it could save lives, right? Because, we know that people died from being overweight and having diabetes and so forth, right? So this could be a life-saving, it can make the same claim about being a life-saving as any other thing that goes through the FDA, right? And yet, if you had to go through the FDA, you could, you'd spend 10 years and thousands of people might die, right? If people, you can make the argument that way. So I think, good for you for going that route. You're gonna, live and die you should live and die by the patients, right? By the people, whether they find it useful or not. And so I think it's perfectly, it's the right way to go. And Go ahead.
Ethan, take the other question about what has been your reception? What has been the reception from the medical community?
All right, I promise I'm going to get that, but let me just quickly address.
Oh, wait. Sorry.
Which is, I think, there is a tension, and I'm keenly aware of it, because I think you can look at these unregulated industries, and I think the best example I can think of is the supplement industry. Right? I mean, supplements are like the best business. I mean, if you look at margins and stuff, I mean, if you want to make money, just go make supplements because they're unregulated. And so what we don't want to be that. And so there is some in between, right? And obviously we chose a path that we're making what we're considering to be a consumer, health and wellness device, and that consumers are going to make the choice about whether they want to use it, and we're going to deliver diet based on performance in the marketplace. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't in the future go down the path of developing a more medical type device, but at the beginning we chose to go that way. But I do want to acknowledge that it's not 100% clean, that there is some there is a fine line right between being a snake oil salesman and going through this sort of regular FDA path. So I think to answer your question, Anish, the other question, I've been comforted by a couple of things. One was I came to this with a ton of skepticism, and a lot of the fears were probably the product of having grown up in the household where I have a father who's a cardiologist, and I think most of us, having grown up in the 70s and 80s, kind of were trained that fat is bad, and we had no fat anywhere in our house. I mean, we had skim milk and egg beaters and never any cheese or anything, because my dad, as a cardiologist trained in the 70s, kind of came up in this environment that fat is evil. So I think I did come to this with skepticism, and a lot of that was allayed over the years by learning and following and watching, and then a lot of it was allayed by seeing publications from this, from other companies like this company Virto that I've been advising, and I think it's pretty clear that this diet is not for everybody. No diet is for everybody, but I convinced myself that it was at baseline safe. And so if you start with the idea, look, just like a diabetes drug, and the FDA had a benchmark that, back after the whole debacle with the PPR gamma drugs, the TZDs, if you're going to develop a type 2 diabetes drug, you had to prove that it didn't kill people. It didn't have to reduce cardiovascular events. It just had to not kill people. It had to not cause heart attacks. And then it had to reduce hemoglobin A1C. So I came at it with, well, if this thing is actually doing what it looks like it's doing to help people with their metabolic health, losing weight, improving their, insulin glucose homeostasis, but as long as doesn't appear to be causing harm from a cardiovascular standpoint, then I'm going to be comfortable. Now, this gets into a huge conversation that you and the three of us could spend hours talking about, which is how do you define, cardiovascular risk, and which of these markers matters, and how do you put them all together? And I don't want to get too distracted by that, but I did convince myself by looking at the markers that there was, at least on a population level, the absence of a really potent signal of harm.
I just want to ask you one question, actually, out of self-interest, because I have a couple of patients who have come to me after being on the keto diet, and then who saw their lipids really go up.
Yeah.
And it's not true of all of them. I think, in fact, probably for the majority, the lipids either don't change or get better as they lose weight and so forth. But there seems to be a subset, and I think that's also recognized in the field, that people know that there's a subset of people whose lipids go up.
Yeah.
And the answer is that we don't know if that's bad or good, right? I mean, at the end of the day.
We don't. And so I tell people that you have four. So I tell people you have four choices when it comes to, let's say and by the way, you described it perfectly. There's a subset. We do not know how big that subset is. Some people say 15, 20, 25, 30% of people, when they go on the standard ketogenic diet, that they have an increase in what looks like bad lipids, right? LDL cholesterol, ApoB, LDL particles, small dense, whatever you choose, whichever metric. And so you have four choices. One choice is to ignore it. And there is a group of people out there who are very skeptical of the role of lipids in cardiovascular disease and advocate that you can ignore it. There's a sort of less severe position, which is ignore it, but get a calcium scan. Mm-hmm. And if your calcium scan is okay, you can really ignore it. And I have to say, that strategy to me in the right person maybe is not horrible. So that's option one. Option 2 is you can say, well, I'm going to stop this diet. I'm going to eat a plant-based diet or eat something else. Option 3 is you can say, all right, well, maybe it looks like a lot of this is being driven, these abnormal bad effects on cholesterol. Maybe that's being driven not so much by the total fat that you're eating, but by that subset of saturated fat. And so what you could do is to say, well, I'm going to change the ratio of saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. So in other words, replace the pork and the beef and the bacon, maybe not entirely, but to at least some degree with olive oil and olives and, nuts and guacamole, avocados. And then the last option is, well, if you like the diet and you feel good on it, you've lost weight, and it's your diabetes or whatever it is better, and your lipids are out of whack and it makes you nervous, you can go on a statin, or you can take Zetia, or you can take a PCSK9 inhibitor. So I think there are 4 ways to deal with this, and I've seen a bunch of different people do it. What I am not absolutely not advocating is that we just sort of throw out the LDL hypothesis and say.
I agree with you. I don't. So I think with the first option of sort of getting a calcium scan and seeing, I think you can use it to monitor. You don't have to just do it one time. Right. So you can do that and sort of monitor over time.
That's
what
people do.
If you see a signal, then
that's a hard argument. That is a hard argument to refute. Of course, we don't have data, right? We have no outcomes, and we're all operating in this sort of like glorified guessing game. But it's hard to refute that if you have a calcium score of 0 and you're a 60-year-old man, you've been eating nothing but beef for 15 years, and you like it.
Right.
I don't know.
I have a patient with type 2 diabetes who's in his 60s, who's overweight, 230 pounds, and whose calcium score is it is actually bizarre. 5 years ago it was 2, and now it's 0.
Yeah.
Now he's on a statin, but he's sort of chomping at the bit trying to get off of a statin, and that's actually part of the reason why I relented and agreed to repeat the calcium scan.
Have you guys seen, this as an aside, I don't want to get distracted, but I just recently had a patient who got a calcium scan, and they reported it as having microcalcifications. Have you seen, the calcium score was 0, but it was reported as having microcalcifications.
I've had radiologists report calcification that's below the level of detection of the algorithm. Yeah. I've had a score of 0.5 actually. A score of F. Yeah.
So Ethan, just to clarify, I know you've touched on it a number of times over our last hour, but what potential downsides do you see for being on a high protein diet?
Oh, so let me clarify. It's not high protein. Yeah. It's moderate protein. So this is one of the key and important points is if you eat high protein. So if you think of nutrition, so macronutrients, right? The 3 things that we put in our bodies: fats, protein, and carbohydrates. If you think of that, it's one of the rare instances in life where there is true zero-sumness, right? So if you reduce your intake of carbohydrates, if you're going to eat the same number of calories per day, you got to replace those calories with something else. So you do not replace them with protein. You keep protein intake moderate the same. It's about 30%. Typical American diet. You have to replace the carbohydrates with fat. And so what are the risks? Well, we don't know. I mean, the truth is, my sort of pat answer is we don't have any idea what the risks or benefits are of any nutritional intervention in a way that would satisfy the evidence-based medicine crowd, because we just don't have any. I mean, short of Predimed, which was basically, at least what I'm told, kind of half, I don't know if made up is too strong of a word, but has a problem. There just are no RCTs where you randomize people to X, Y, or Z nutrition and follow them over years and then measure the effect on clinically meaningful hard outcomes. So until we have those, we have to make guesses, right? This is where we're left.
I don't know, Ethan. It looks like very likely you're going to end up in Vinay's next book, Medical Reversal.
Yeah. Which way? Positive or negative? Yeah.
Operating without RCTs makes the chances of reversal very high.
Yeah, well, the thing is, like, this is one of the things, like in nutrition, you can say that for a drug or for a device, right, where
I know.
there was a 0 point. But for nutrition, we all have been eating something forever. So there is, what is baseline? What do you consider to be gold standard, or what is, Anyway, I think, one of the risks is undoubtedly, I'm uncomfortable if somebody comes to me and says my LDL cholesterol before I started doing this was 110 and now it's 195. As maybe someday I'll change my mind on this, but today at least I'm uncomfortable with that. So I would be comfortable monitoring it like we just described with the calcium scan. Other things, I described the 4 different things that I would do, but that to me is a risk. I think that people should have their cholesterol checked anytime they make any big nutrition change, but particularly this one, because I do consider that to be a risk. There are other biologically plausible risks that I think are unexplored, but there are changes in other hormones, and potentially there may be effects on bone or other things. I think, people love to talk about these, different primitive cultures where people eat this way. I think the Inuits in Alaska, right? They eat almost all fat. And of course, babies are born on a ketogenic diet. In fact, I'm told that the sort of breath that somebody gets, that acetone on their breath when you're on the ketogenic diet, reminds people of baby's breath. My wife doesn't agree with that. She doesn't think my breath smells like a baby's breath, but of course babies are born, into a very high fat diet. And so they're in nutritional ketosis is the term we use when they're born through the time that they're on breast milk.
Well, that's Ethan. That was a great conversation. We're gonna let you go, wrap it up here.
Yeah.
For people who don't already follow you on Twitter, your Twitter handle is
again super creative. Ethan J. Weiss.
Ethan J. Weiss. We'll have that on the show notes. Your company is Keto. It's already it's available for purchase.
Well, it's sort of available. It's pre-available. It's and
at keto.com or
it's Get Keto.
Get Keto. Keyto. Getketo.com.
Getketo.com. Yeah.
You're on the UCSF website, in the news frequently, and it's great having you. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this or something else with you.
Well, at some point we have to talk about our experience as fellows, but we can do that over dinner.
That sounds great.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right, Ethan. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Super fun. Thank you.